Hello and welcome to Varn blog. I'm responding to some comments that were interesting because they actually open up some interesting things of analysis. Things of analysis is the way to phrase that, excuse me. Areas of analysis that require us to unpack a few things. I had someone say in response to one of my things on literacy that reading is leisure time. It takes a fair amount of reflection and mental capacity to do. It's actually a high yield, high investment social technology. And I responded that reading is only leisure time if it's not relevant to what you're doing for social reproduction or production. That leisure time um, does not just mean not doing physical labor, because if that was true, most of you were being considered doing leisure time most of the time. Because how many of you are still doing physical labor, working with your bodies to put in that kind of labor? Now, Marx is not going to be in much help here. And the stats are a little bit confusing, and I'll get to why. But one question is, do we have more or less leisure time than we used to? And depending on how you count, the answer is maybe. Let's look at what we have to say. So, particularly, does the working class, whatever that is, have more leisure time? Well, one of the problems you're going to have about the working class is how it's defined. So let's get into that. How did the average liberal policy groups define working class? So we have this piece from the American Progress, Cap 20, and of course it's American Progress, so they talk about the working class being more racially diverse. That's the big takeaway, even though that should be fucking obvious. Today's working class is far different than the working class of more than half a century ago at the height of America's manufacturing appointment in the job market. So how is she defining the working class? Well, she's defining the working class this way. This analysis defines working class as comprised of the labor force participants who do not have a 4-year college degree. Now, this is unclear to me if this is just jobs that don't require a 4-year college degree, and we're counting those, or are we counting just the people who don't have a 4-year college degree? From the chart, it's the people, but I'm going to get to why that's a problem in a minute. It refers to non-working class respondents as college educated, defining them as individuals in the labor force with at least 4 years of college degree or higher level of education. So associate's degree don't count. Income can also be used as a measure of class membership, but it is far more variable by respondents' age and job status than is education. See, that's interesting. So she's bracketing it out because income doesn't actually tie that much to age and job status more than education. See, this is actually a huge indicator. So she'll count you as working class if you don't have an education, even if you're working a higher status job, and vice versa. For more detailed approach using this analysis, see the methodology section. Some surveys and press accounts rely on self-reported status of class membership, but individual attitudes towards this topic are shaped by a number of factors and change over time. A 2022 Gallup poll found that 46% of American adults identify as either working or lower class, while the rest identifies as upper middle, and middle class. So again, not particularly helpful. Now, one of the caveats to this way of doing analysis is actually can be found in Forbes. Let me share it with you. This is from an article that's relatively recent. And I'm going to put all this in the show notes, by the way. Share my screen. The growing gap between college grads and available jobs. This is from uh, August of last year. While 52% of college graduates are working jobs that don't require higher education, 75% of them remain in this situation for a full decade after college. So 75% of that 52 stay in jobs that don't require working degrees, which is part of why there's so much variability in job status. So when people talk about working class and just use education as a proxy, it's actually deceptive because over half of the people who graduate at any given time do not work in jobs that require a degree at all. So they may not be accruing the social and economic benefits of their college education. And it seems like while that was always kind of common for the first 2 or 3 years after college, the period where that's likely to happen and the percentage of that group that stays that way is going up. This is what Peter Turchin meant by the overproduction of elites. Let's go back to the report on the working class, and we'll get to my point about leisure. Today's working class is far more different than the working class of more than half a century ago. Yet widespread misconceptions persist about people without a four-year college degree who make up the working class. Throughout the 2016 and 2020 election cycles, the term became, in some circles, nearly synonymous with white workers in manufacturing and skilled trades. Now, manufacturing is less than 15% of the workforce. Well, I've actually shown that many times. The term has become a new Center for American Progress analysis reveals that, in fact, today's working class is more diverse than ever. I mean, I would even say the manufacturing sector is probably less white than we are imagining it to be. But all of this is based off of the fact that non-Hispanic white workers still make up the majority of all the population, but they're actually a higher majority of the college educated. La duh! Like, all right. According to data from the 2021 American Community Survey, the current working class largely works in services, particularly retail, healthcare, food service, and accommodation. And that's healthcare that's not nursing and or doctors, because we're not including anyone who has a college degree in this, remember? And building services, though manufacturing and construction remains large employers as well, but in the overall scheme of the country, they're only about 50% of employment. They're probably higher than that amongst the working class, because you have to remember 40% of the population, or about 38.9%, it's actually been declining recently, of the population has a four-year degree. But go back to that caveat that I mentioned. 52% of people who graduate do not work in their field, or any field that requires a college degree. So they are effectively falling through the tracks in these studies. Black, Hispanic, and other workers make up 45%. That's slightly higher than the average, which is about 30. So it's about 50% higher than the general population. But still, nearly half of the working class is women, and 8% have disabilities. And that's not dealing with the 1 in 10 workers who don't. Maybe this does. I figure out this considers the 1 in 10 who have disabilities who are not working at all. These statistics highlight the need for policies that address the challenges for working class families. Blah, 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 blah. We can skip that. That's as think progress should. The majority of American workers are part of the working class, meaning the majority of people do not have a college degree of 4 years or more. But the percentage that does have a college degree is rather large, and larger than any sector within the working class. It's 38% of the population. Services do not make up 38% of employment. But here's the general breakdown. And again, go back to that caveat that I had from Forbes. Only 52% of people who are college educated work in jobs that require college education. Do they count as working class or not? According to this study, they don't, because there's so much variability in income based by age. and by sector. These numbers mean that policies directed towards the working class have an outsized impact on the health of the economy. The working class is more racially and ethnically diverse than before. Workers in color and white workers make up nearly the same share, although 5% is actually a pretty big difference in a country of 330 million, but nonetheless. Women make up nearly half the working class. Women make up 44% of the working class. That's 44% of people who have jobs who do not have college degrees. This has been relatively consistent since the 1990s. It has gone down a little bit after COVID. We have seen a decrease of 1.6 million people in the labor force in between 2019 and 2021. And given birth rates, this is not likely to be reversed anytime real soon. Workers with disabilities are highly represented amongst the working class, aka they can't get jobs in higher ed. Disabled workers make up nearly twice as much of the working class as they do the college-educated labor force. And again, the college-educated labor force are measuring jobs that require a college degree, which is why there are mismatches in this data, and I think we're going to really have to work that out. According to CPA analysis, 8 million working class Americans describe themselves as having a disability. So industrial policies may not only raise standards in industry where the disabled worker working or employed, but also incorporate protections as bad routes to entry and boost retention for disabled workers in all sectors. Working class people are more likely to work retail or hold service, construction, or manufacturing jobs. That's a big fucking. Additionally, home health aides and professional care constitute the largest working class labor force, one of the largest working class labor forces in the country, 1.6 million. Certain industries, especially construction and elementary and secondary school education, are common amongst both working and college educated workers. These are the areas where associate degree holders and stuff can actually work alongside people who aren't working class, which tells you this is not about what you do for liberals. This is about what your education status is on the census. Members of the working class are far more likely to be employed in retail, accommodation, and food services, material and truck driving, logistics, building or cleaning, and other service roles. Even in construction, they largely work as laborers, not management. I added the not management part, but that's obvious. The overall dominance of the service sector roles in the working class has been increasing for decades. With a slowdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and will likely only increase in the future. All right. Top state industries for the working class. Construction, 8.8 million. Restaurant and food services, 5 million. Medical and surgical hospitals, medical and surgical hospitals, especially hospital service workers, 3 million. Elementary and secondary schools, these are the support staff, aides, anything that doesn't require a degree, 2.5 million. Supermarkets and grocery stores, 1.8 million. Truck transportation, 1.7 million. General merchandise stores, including warehouse clubs and supercenters, 1.6 million. Justice, public order and safety activities, 1.6 million. Service buildings and dwellings, 1.5 million. All right. Laborers and freight and stock movers, 2.2 million. So the vast majority of the working class is probably in services, and then logistics, and then construction is one big thing. There's not a whole lot of people in manufacturing. Janitors and building cleaners, 2 million. First line supervisors of retail sale workers, 1.9 million. Other management Management's listed as working class if they don't hold a degree, 1.8 million. Customer service representatives, 1.8 million. Retail salesperson, 1.7 million. Cashiers, 1.7 million. Construction laborers, 1.6 million. Cooks, 1.5 million. Let's compare that to the college educated. Elementary and middle school teachers, 2.6 million. Other managers, 2.5 million. Registered nurses, 2.5 million. So this is the quote lower end of the quote PMC unquote. Software developers, 1.5 million and declining. Accountants and auditors, 1.6 million. Judges, magistrates, and other judicial workers, 1.2 million. Secondary school teachers, 1.5 million. So they separated secondary and post-secondary and primary school here. That's interesting. Middle school is actually usually with secondary. Post-secondary teachers, 1.08 million. Chefs and chief executives and legislatures, 1.6 million, and physicians, 900,000 roughly. I don't actually understand how those work in top industries. Is that the people who work in them are the amount of money? These jobs by working class are often offer low pay, few protections, and insufficient workers' voice on the job. Non-union construction and manufacturing jobs are often low paying, while other predominant area members of the working class, including the service sector, food sector, healthcare, retail, and home care, commonly offer low wages, few benefits, and insufficient local worker protections. These problems are widespread. While only 70% of workers with a 4-year degree lack health insurance through their employers or labor unions, 37% of workers in the working class lack such insurance. Lower quality jobs worsen economic disparities, blah, 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 blah. So, what does this have to do with leisure time? Well, one, it's hard to even know who the working class is, but if retail is where things are going, leisure time is actually maybe higher than you think, because a lot of these kinds of jobs don't offer full-time hours. Furthermore, it's hard to get a feel on where leisure time is. So we're going to try to. I found a few studies that try to use time use, but it's from Our World in Data. And I don't know that I necessarily trust it, but anyway. Time use perspective of an average day. So this is what the chart is. So according to this, paid work, work and school and study, sleep, personal care, eating and drinking, radio, other leisure, blah, 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 blah. This is a breakdown of your day. So according to this, the average worker in China works 315 minutes a day. The average in Mexico works 302. Let's look at Canada, 269 minutes. In the US, 259 minutes. The patterns of how they spend their leisure time, bracketing out sleep, which for everyone is about 8 hours, with China for some reason averaging 9. I don't know that that's real. One of the interesting things is the US and Canada both have relatively high, compared to other countries, areas of unpaid labor. So this is labor that is in care work or volunteering that is unpaid. For the US, it's about an hour and a half a day. For Canada, it's about 81 minutes a day. But like for India and China, it's very low. Home work and shopping is listed. Housework and shopping is listed together. That's interesting. With the highest being in Mexico and India, and then the US being roughly similar to China. And then you look at entertainment hours a day, leisure time. Leisure time in China is 280 minutes. Leisure time in the US is 292 minutes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how is this calculated? um, These are from surveys between 2009 and 2016, so they're probably not even still accurate. There's a gender gap in leisure time. Time for men is shown on a horizontal axis, while time for women appears to be in a vertical axis. The dotted line notes the gender parity. So the further away from the country is from the diagonal line, the bigger the difference is between leisure time. The dotted diagonal line denotes gender parity. So the further the country is on the diagonal line, the larger the difference is. So the United States is pretty far away. Let's find the US here. When men's leisure time averages 327 minutes, where women's leisure time averages 285 minutes. Now, according to this, that is about equal to the amount of paid work done in a day. Now, do I believe this? No, not necessarily. This seems wildly optimistic. I'm going to try to figure. I think these surveys are taking people at face value who are misaccounting their time. So the question is, we're not getting to the lonely academic. What about working hours? Are we working more than ever? Working hours for the average worker has decreased dramatically over the last 150 years. It's come from working fewer hours each day, fewer hours each week, and fewer hours each year. While working hours have declined in many countries, today's richest ones, there are still large differences across and within each country. Working hours per worker have declined after the Industrial Revolution. I don't know how we know this, because we actually do have evidence that peasants actually worked less per day than we do. Chart here shows the average working hours since 1870 for a selection of countries that industrialized early. You can add or remove countries by clicking whenever. Show the annual total so the trends account for changes in both length and working day as the number of working days throughout the year. The data comes from research by the economic historians Michael Herberman and Chris Mines, who brought together evidence from historical records, national data accounts, and other sources. So this is compiled and estimated, of course. In 1870, workers of these countries worked more than 3,000 hours annually, equivalent to 60, 70 hours a week for 50 weeks per year. But today we see that working hours have been roughly cut in half. In Germany, for example, the average working hour increased nearly 80% from 3,000 hours in the late 19th century to 15,000 hours in the 2010s. And the UK decrease was around 40%. In recent decades, working hours have continued to decline in many countries, but there are large differences between countries. Zooming out in the last 70 years and looking at other countries beyond those that industrialized orally, the data reveals a continued decline in working hours in many countries, but also differences between countries. In a chart here, we zoom into a period from 1950 and change the selection of countries to highlight some of the diversity and trends. For some countries, such as Germany, working hours have continued their steep historical decline. For other countries, such as the US, the decline has leveled off in recent decades. In some countries, we see an inverted U-shaped pattern. In South Korea, for example, hours rose dramatically between 1950 and 1980 before falling again in the mid 80s. And in other countries, we've seen no recent declines. In China, for example, hours actually rose in the 1990s and early 2000s before leveling off, which surprises no one if you know the history of China. So there are shorter work days, but also more holidays and paid vacation days a year. Now, this is very different than the medieval period, but this seems to be pretty good compared to the early capitalism, which was a particularly shitty in its work week. What's my point? My point is, it's hard to even know who we're talking about when we're talking about the working class. And there does seem to be a lot of exhaustion. But the exhaustion can't be explained only in terms of more work hours. While the US hasn't seen a decline in work hours despite predictions that it would, thank you, Keynes, for being wrong yet again, um, there was a steady decline for a long time in Europe, although that is probably going to level off these days. One of the things that we have to ask ourselves then what else is competing for our attention? Why do we feel so harried? After all, there's a lot of signs of chronic stress and loneliness, although the site does argue against the loneliness, but I found more recent data that seems to contradict it. So I'll put that in the show notes as well. Loneliness and stress are interesting because people do seem to feel more stressed, but it might be because of change in the nature of the stress they feel. Acute stress is good for you, at least in moderate amounts. That's why exercise tones your muscles and shapes your mind. But chronic stress, where you don't ever relieve the stress, where you stay in flight, or fawn mode all the time, but never see that dissipate, leads to all kinds of hormone disruptions and all kinds of other problems, and would probably scramble your ability to have executive function. Add to that the demands of things like social media and even the way you're seeing this, it might be that leisure feels less leisurely and thus it's harder to concentrate. But it is just not true that we are working so many hours that we don't have time to read. There's more things demanding our attention. Now, also, and I'll come back to this, it's hard to tell how literate society was in other times. We often used to think that like only like 1 in 4 people were literate in certain other periods, but it seems like in late antiquity, actually, it may have been as well up to half. Although, again, with no way to know how literate, are we just talking about the ability to decode simple words, or could they read books? And in the 19th century, there was a lot of reading going on that was communal. 19th, 18th century, etc. So the education meetings and stuff would not just be teaching people how to read, but would also be reading fairly complicated text to the entire group out loud and discussing it as you read it out loud. So the most literate people in the group would read the book for everybody. We don't do those kind of things anymore, although you could argue that podcasts, TV shows, etc., all are designed to be a proxy for that, with the added complication that they delete your executive function to some deplete, not delete, although delete might be appropriate, your executive function to some degree. So to sum up, there's more workers than people think, but they're not in the industries that people think they're in. Manufacturing workers are actually probably the smallest part of the major sectors of the working class. Two, liberals don't define working class in the same way that everyone else does. They define it based off whether or not you have a college education, not whether or not you hold a working class job. That's why they can talk about working class people and middle class or college educated people in the same job sectors. That's weird when you're thinking about work defining you, but yet work is being defined by education. Three, there's a lot more educated people than there used to be, but there seems to be an increasing trend to educate people for jobs that don't exist and have them go back into the working class. This would lead to a lot of frustration, a lot of misidentification of class issues. Four, the largest sections of the college educated class are still in jobs that are relatively high paying compared to non college educated jobs, but low paying compared to what people think college educated jobs are. Five, there have been a decrease of work hours and work per hour in the 20th century pretty massively. And while in the US that seems to have stalled out probably around the 1980s, it's hard to actually say how much leisure time people have, and the studies seem to overestimate it because they're based off surveys and self-reporting. What's my point? My point is we don't know as much about why this is declining, but we can't say it's just because reading is leisure time. Particularly when more and more work, even non-college educated work, requires some small level of literacy, although maybe what this indicates is less and less work needs literacy because of things like video communication. I don't know. We need better studies, and we don't have them. But don't make excuses based off leisure time. It explains some bits, but not all of it. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. And if you want more boring ass analysis like this, where someone tells you the truth about things as they can find it, continue watching. Protect your peace.